This case takes place in the USA in 1971. In a quiet suburb, one man transformed into a family annihilator, a real term reserved for the most diabolical criminals. The house remained untouched for weeks after the incident. Inside was silence, broken only by religious hymns echoing from the speaker system. Photographs scattered throughout the house showed a typical American family living the American dream, until the perpetrator destroyed his own family and cut his face out of every single photograph to preserve his freedom. No one knew where he went or who he became. That was until it was uncovered nearly 20 years later by a strange twist of fate. Meet John Emil List. John was born in Bay City, Michigan in 1925. He was an only child, raised in a strict Lutheran household. John was described as a quiet and meticulous boy who found comfort in order and religious devotion. He kept to himself and rarely stepped out of line. When World War II began, John enlisted in the United States Army and served as a laboratory technician. After the war, he used government funding to earn degrees in business and accounting at the University of Michigan. But in 1950, the Army recalled him to active duty for the Korean War. It was during this time that John met a woman named Helen Taylor, a widow whose first husband had died in combat. John and Helen married in Maryland in 1951. John adopted Helen's daughter from her previous marriage and later had 3 children of his own: Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. Patricia was the eldest. She was passionate about theater and hoped to one day become an actress. But John disapproved of this ambition and considered it morally inappropriate. At school, Patricia was friendly and outgoing, but at home, she frequently clashed with her father over her interests and behavior. John Jr. was different. He was athletic and studious. He played on the high school soccer team and was known as a polite young man and dependable student. He was the most physically active of the 3 and often tried to meet his father's strict standards. Frederick was the youngest. He was quiet, gentle, and loved to lose himself in a good book. Of the 3, he had the calmest temperament and was deeply attached to his older siblings. Over the next decade, John moved his family from state to state as he climbed the corporate ladder. By 1965, he had secured a position as vice president and chief accountant at a bank in New Jersey. With his increased earnings, he purchased a 19-room Victorian mansion called Breeze Knoll in the affluent suburb of Westfield. John's mother, Alma, was aging and needed support, so she moved in with the family. From the outside, John's life appeared to be a portrait of success and moral order. He attended church, taught Sunday school, and even led a Boy Scout group. Neighbors described him as polite but rather rigid. He always wore a tie, even when mowing the lawn. But the neighbors couldn't see the pressure building inside. Helen had contracted syphilis years earlier and never told John. When he discovered this, the marriage began to deteriorate. In public, he maintained a composed exterior, but behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. By 1971, John's carefully managed image had started to collapse. He had lost his job at the bank earlier that year but told no one. Every morning he would put on his suit and leave the house as if going to work, when in reality he spent his days sitting at the train station, reading newspapers, trying to avoid suspicion. At home, bills were accumulating. He was approximately $11,000 behind on his mansion's mortgage. By any standard, this was a huge amount, but especially for that time. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $88,000 in today's money. He had taken out a second mortgage to stay afloat, but even that was no longer sufficient, and his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat or accept help. After a while, John began to view his situation as hopeless. He was convinced that failure would destroy not just the family's lifestyle, but also their spiritual integrity. But it wasn't just that. Helen's condition made things worse. She had become increasingly ill and withdrawn. She spent many days in bed suffering from headaches and depression, using alcohol to numb the pain. The children were also embracing the freedoms of the era in ways that alarmed their conservative father. Patricia had developed a passion for acting and theater. John found this deeply inappropriate. Rumors began circulating that Patricia was researching witchcraft, either for school or out of personal curiosity. In John's worldview, this was a sign of spiritual danger. The children could now see that this situation was affecting him. Allegedly, Patricia half-jokingly told a teacher that her father might kill them all. And tragically, she was right. John was already thinking along these lines. He believed his family was drifting too far from the values he cherished. He began to see death as the only way to save them. A psychiatrist would later describe John's thinking as fixated and inflexible, but John saw it as clarity. He convinced himself that God would understand what he was about to do, and so he got to work. He planned everything in detail. He made sure the children's schools and employers believed they would be away visiting relatives in early November. He canceled deliveries to the house, milk, newspapers, and mail. He even verified that Helen's mother wouldn't be visiting as expected. By the first week of November, all preparations were complete. The house was ready. John saw himself as a man who had no other options. He couldn't save his family from ruin in this life, so instead, he would send them to heaven. On the morning of Tuesday, November 9th, 1971, John woke up early and prepared himself for what he had planned. He helped his children get ready for school and sent them off as usual. Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick each walked out the door, unaware of their father's sinister plans. The house became quiet. John then headed to his garage to retrieve two handguns. He had a 9mm semi-automatic pistol and a .22 caliber revolver. He chose his moment carefully. His wife, Helen, was sitting at the kitchen table drinking her customary morning coffee. Approaching from behind, John raised the 9mm pistol and shot Helen in the side of the head at close range. Blood gushed from her skull as she collapsed onto the tabletop. She died instantly. John took a moment to collect himself. He then climbed the stairs to the third floor. His mother, Alma, was in her small apartment in the mansion preparing her breakfast. John entered and approached his mother directly. He said nothing. He simply raised the revolver and fired one shot above her left eye. Alma collapsed and died in her chair. Later that afternoon, Patricia arrived home first. John met her at the front door. Patricia could never have expected what was about to happen. Before Patricia could say anything as she entered the house, John raised his pistol once more and shot his daughter in the head. Shortly after, Frederick came through the door, the youngest. John shot him in the same manner as his sister, mother, and grandmother. He then picked up his son's lifeless body and carried him into the ballroom. John Jr. was at school for the afternoon and had a football match. So John drove to the school and watched the game from the sidelines. This is a bone-chilling thought, knowing that the rest of the family had just experienced a brutal end. When the game ended, he offered his son a ride home. The two got in the car and began driving back to the mansion. They entered the house together. At some point inside, John took out the pistol and fired at his son. But unlike the others, John Jr. didn't die immediately. There were signs of a slight struggle, but John fired repeatedly, striking him with multiple bullets until he stopped moving. By 5 o'clock in the evening, John had murdered 5 members of his family. He arranged their bodies on sleeping bags beneath the original Tiffany stained glass skylight. In effect, he had turned his house into a tomb. What followed was an eerie and sinister ritual. He lowered the thermostat to slow decomposition. He then set a radio to play religious music through the intercom system, and finally the lights were turned off. He wrote a letter to his pastor, 5 pages long, in which he described his actions. He claimed his family had lost their faith and were slipping into corruption. He also said he couldn't let them face the shame of financial ruin. He believed he had saved them from damnation. Before signing the letter, he asked for forgiveness and explained that he intended to disappear. He then signed the letter and left it on his desk. John then removed every photograph of himself from the house. This action was particularly meticulous. every photograph in the 19-room household. He took scissors and cut his face out as if he had never been there. It was clear he didn't want the police to have an accurate image of his face. After this, some believe he left immediately, but others think he slept in the house that night with the bodies inside. However, before disappearing, he withdrew cash from his mother's bank accounts and packed a few belongings. He then drove to JFK Airport in New York and abandoned the family car to create a false lead. He didn't board a flight that day. Instead, he took a train and vanished into the darkness. By the time police found the bodies, nearly a month later, John was gone. For almost 4 weeks, no one realized anything was wrong. John had canceled everything, so nothing had accumulated on the doorstep or in the mailbox. The lights in the mansion turned on and off automatically. Neighbors believed the house was simply empty, but inside the bodies remained undisturbed, rotting. Over time, the lights began to burn out one by one, but still no one checked inside. But Patricia's drama teacher became concerned and tried to phone the home, but the calls went unanswered. By early December, neighbors hadn't seen them for some time, so they contacted the police. On December 17, 1971, police officers performed a welfare check. They found the doors were locked, so one officer crawled through an open basement window and noted that the house was unusually cold. He could also hear something rather eerie given the context. He heard organ music echoing softly from speakers throughout the home. And then the smell hit him. The sound was accompanied by the thick smell of decay in the air. In the ballroom, police discovered the bodies of Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, each lying on a sleeping bag with a gunshot wound to the head. Upstairs, they found Alma dead in her apartment. The FBI was brought in to assist in what would become one of the largest fugitive manhunts of the decade. Agents traced John's movements to JFK Airport. There, they found the family car abandoned in a long-term parking lot and quickly discovered it had been left there to mislead them. There were no credit card transactions, no job applications in his name, and no paper trail. The only image police could use was from an old passport in a faded high school yearbook. There was hardly anything to go on. Investigators distributed wanted posters across the country. Tips came in, but none led to his location. As you can imagine, the case soon went cold. So where did John go? John had built a new life. He traveled to Michigan and then on to Colorado. By early 1972, he had created a new identity under the name Robert Clark. He initially worked as a cook in the Denver area and then moved to central Denver and found a role as a tax preparer. Soon after, he joined a Lutheran church and volunteered to drive elderly members to service. He kept to himself and never spoke about the past. He knew his new church friends wouldn't approve of his murderous ways. In 1977, during one of the church's picnics, he met a woman named Dolores, and the two began dating. By 1985, he married her, and the couple moved to Maryland, Virginia. John had told her that his first wife had died from cancer, so Dolores never suspected the truth. But that didn't mean the truth wouldn't be uncovered. In 1989, the television show America's Most Wanted aired a special about the John List case. By then, 17 and a half years had passed since the killings. A forensic artist had created an age-progressed clay bust of what John might look like as an older man. The artist, named Frank Bender, had created an eerily accurate depiction, even down to the thick glasses and receding hairline. This must have been a difficult task due to the limited photographic evidence, besides his school yearbook photo found at the house years prior. Investigators saw this as somewhat of a long shot, but the segment reached millions of viewers. The response was overwhelming and led to over 200 tips identifying possible John List sightings around the country, but nearly all were nonsense. However, one tip stood out. A woman named Wanda Flannery had been a neighbor of the Clarks in Denver. She saw the bust on TV and immediately recognized it as her former neighbor, Robert Clark, but she knew him as Bob. Wanda didn't know Bob's new address, but the FBI soon tracked it down. Less than 2 weeks after the broadcast on June 1st, 1989, the FBI and local police descended on his small, quiet accounting office in Virginia. John List was finally taken into custody without incident. At the time of his arrest, he didn't confess his identity. In fact, he calmly insisted that he was Robert Clark and that this was simply a case of mistaken identity. However, investigators were well prepared. They obtained fingerprints from this Bob Clark and within hours had matched them to an old military service print of John List. The alias had finally been unmasked. Confronted with this evidence, John eventually admitted who he really was. He was then extradited back to New Jersey to face justice for the murders. In August 1989, the Union County Grand Jury indicted John on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 charge for each: his wife, mother, and 3 children. John List pleaded not guilty, and his case proceeded to trial in early 1990. After many years, John stood in a courtroom to answer for his crimes. At this point, he was a soft-spoken 64-year-old man, a former Sunday school teacher, accused of slaughtering his entire family in cold blood. John's defense didn't deny that he was the killer. The physical evidence in his own confession letter made it undeniable. Instead, they mounted an insanity defense, claiming John suffered from a mental disorder that prevented him from knowing right from wrong. The prosecutors, however, forcefully argued that John List knew exactly what he was doing and that this was first-degree murder, plain and simple. They emphasized the level of planning and cold-blooded execution. John had months to reconsider, and he didn't. He shot his victims, often from behind without warning, and carried out practical steps to evade capture. Confronted with John's own words and overwhelming evidence, the jury found him sane and guilty on all 5 counts of murder after just 9 days of trial. On April 12, 1990, John Emil List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing the very next day, John finally broke his stoic silence. In a brief statement, he said he was sorry for what happened, but stopped short of taking full responsibility. The judge then imposed the maximum sentence: 5 life terms in prison to be served consecutively. This effectively ensured that John List would never be eligible for parole. John List, who was 64 at the time, was led away in handcuffs to begin his life behind bars. The long-delayed reckoning had finally arrived. Over time, he gave a handful of interviews to journalists. In one, he expressed regret for what he had done, but insisted he believed it was necessary at the time. He said he prayed for forgiveness every day, but never showed remorse for the lives he had taken. John said he never did anything to himself because that would be a sin which would have prevented him from entering heaven. He believed that by staying alive and repenting, he could still be reunited with his family in the afterlife. This logic underpins the warped thinking that had driven him to commit mass murder. He never fully acknowledged the scale of his crimes, and in interviews he always remained calm and rational. To many, he still looked like an elderly accountant rather than a man who had executed his entire family. The town of Westfield never forgot what happened. The mansion where the murders occurred was destroyed by fire in 1972. The blaze was ruled suspicious, but no one was ever charged. Due to disrepair, the house was later demolished. A new property was built on the site, but the land remained associated with the tragedy. John's story became a fixture in true crime media. Books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations were produced over the years. Writers and psychologists studied the case as a textbook example of a family annihilator. John List died in prison in 2008 from complications related to pneumonia. He was 82 years old. He never showed remorse and never sought forgiveness from the extended family. He likely remained content with what he had done.